it said, I could ask if I wanted to get involved
Awesome.
or join it.
Yay. Okay.
Well, it's fine.
Joining.
What?
I think people are slowly joining. Sharon.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Sharon just told me that you guys are besties.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, I did not know that. That's awesome.
Co-workers, which is so cool.
Yes. What up, Jesse?
Oh, therapy for the brown soul is here. Awesome. Okay. Ooh, my Apple Watch. It's okay. It's 7 p.m., so I guess we can start. Again, intro. We're going to talk about singleness, being brown, being Christian, the struggles, what we've learned along the way. And yeah, send in your questions, send in your comments as we're talking. And we'll start off with Maureen just sharing a little bit about herself. Even though we're already sharing as we go. So
yeah, of course, no problem. Hey there, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Maureen. I am originally from California, and I am on staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Something I never thought I would do, but even though I'm originally from California, I live in Austin, Texas. So just a little bit about me. It's kind of crazy that we're doing this live as the Indian matchmaking show is on Netflix, and like literally all my friends are texting me about it and like, is this for real? And Indian and non-Indian people are like, is this serious or is this a parody? And so it's funny that is happening at the exact same time that this is happening. So a little bit about myself. I'm in my late 30s. I come from a Marthoma background, just so you have a little context of kind of maybe my upbringing, even though we may not all be the same. Because I grew up in California, my parents are a little more progressive. They're open to me dating or marrying anyone I want. However, they would prefer for me to marry an Indian guy. And honestly, it's been my preference to want to marry a South Asian man. And so I have dated people of all different ethnicities. I would say from my 20s to 30s, I did barely date. And a big part of that was because I felt like the Lord actually called me to wait. And so if you have questions around waiting, we're going to talk a little bit about that later on today. But one of the most significant things that happened in my 20s around singleness was my friend and I, she was also my roommate at the time. I had heard from one of my friends in San Diego who was single that she was praying with one of her like single, or I think her friend was married, but she was praying with one of her friends and they prayed every day for their spouses. And I was like, oh my gosh. And like, they were really intentional. And I was like, and like they both, and like she ended up finding someone. And so I was like, oh my gosh. Hey, Marisol, welcome. Hey, Dolly, it's good to see you. And so literally my friend, like that story inspired me to want to pray for my significant other. And so I asked my roommate, I was like, hey, like what if we prayed every day for our significant other? And so she was like, okay. And so we like started waking up every morning. And we literally started praying and we started asking the Lord, like, God, like, we really want to be married. I mean, we also came from the background of like, our God is a big God. We can ask him anything. We can be big. We can be bold. We can be specific. And so literally we prayed very specifically. We were like, she was white. I'm Indian. I want an Indian guy. She wants a Latino guy. I mean, we were like specific in what we wanted. And we also were like, God, we want these men in our lives by January of next year. It's kind of insane, you know, now we're saying it out loud. But literally like God, like changed our prayers, and I will share the detailed story later if you want to hear it. But literally like he led us to Psalm 63, which I'm going to read a little bit from Psalm 63. It says, you, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you, I thirst for you, my whole being longs for you, in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I've seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. And I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. And I think my friend and I just felt convicted, like, are we really like satisfied with God? Or are we trying to be satisfied with men in our lives? And that actually took a big change in our prayer lives. And we prayed for 5 years, Monday through Friday. The first year it was a 7 a.m. and then it slowly went to 8 a.m. But we were still praying. But we ended up, even though we were still praying for our significant others, like we were really praying for joy and contentment in our singleness. We started interceding from our friends, seeing our friends come to know Jesus, praying for healing. So anyways, that was a pretty significant prayer change, in the sense of like, of course we can ask God for these things, but deep down is the root of that, were we really seeking and loving God the same way we desired a significant other? And so other than that, I've had one serious relationship that was like leading towards maybe, marriage and even moving. But that's a little bit of background just to have some context about me.
I love that. I love like how your prayer started as something of like, hey, I want a husband, and my dad's gonna pass by, so hi Dad. I wanted that initially, and just like seeing how that changed. And for me personally, I think my story is a little bit different. So I'm in my late 20s, but I don't know. I feel like I never even thought about marriage or anything like that. Like when I was in college, or even I currently have a roommate, but I'm like in my parents' house because of quarantine and whatnot. But it was always like in the back of my head, but it was really kind of cultural and society kind of making me consider marriage at all. And around the time I was 22, my parents had this mentality of like, to succeed or to like do well was to be married. So, if I'm loving my child, like I want them to be married first. So I first started thinking about marriage because of my parents and like wanting to like be a good Indian daughter and like pleasing them. But I've also gone through my own journey, and I'm on dating apps, and I've gone through like dates through that way, but I've actually never been in a serious relationship before. So I think that's also like a different perspective to have. But and I don't have a cool story about praying for marriage, like changing and whatnot, but I can just honestly thank God that I did not get married at 22. And there were so many, like, even though it's kind of funny, it's like I haven't been in a relationship, but I've had like marriage proposals, so I could have been married before, but I just didn't sense that was God's will for my life. So that's kind of my background and story. But okay. So next we can talk about being single in your 20s versus being single in your 30s. So I come and ask you, what is it like being single in your 30s?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say like in my 20s, and this, like, feel free to chime on in because this is where I feel like we could just even piggyback up each other. I feel like in my 30s, so in my 20s, I definitely dated. And even in the midst of like God saying wait, I was not expecting wait to be like a long-term thing. And it ended up being like 7 years of waiting. And it came out of the fact I liked this guy. He actually asked me out. He gave me his number, and he was long distance. And then I thought he was moving to Austin. He didn't. And it literally, I was like, what the heck? What happened? And as I was praying about it, I felt like God said, wait. And I was like, wait, what does that mean? And literally, if you're like wondering, like, how do you know if God's calling you to wait? I mean, he gave me like Psalm 27, which at the end says, wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, wait for the Lord. And I was like, okay. But then like I told like a handful of my friends, and they were like, okay, that's cool. But literally, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of grateful I didn't get married in my 20s because I was immature too. Not saying that I like am way more mature now. But I would say in my 20s, it felt like more like, oh, it would be fun. Like, I want to date and just to get to know, like, who do I even want to be with? I would say in my 30s, I definitely think now that I know myself more, it makes such a big difference. Thinking about dating and what it is that I'm looking for. I think as I've thought about this, I mean, I talk about this a lot with my girlfriends, so it's something that I've like thought about a lot. The generation that I grew up in, since I am in my later 30s, was the generation, if you grew up in the church, of kissing, dating, goodbye. It's like the Joshua Harris kind of time. And during that time, like, I think like what I realized was because like the church, Indian church, American church, whatever church you were part of, if you were part of a church, it was really like, don't date, be so careful, like everything, like
You're frozen. of like, you don't want to be the rose that's battered and like ruined, so don't date anyone.
Exactly. And I think if you add that to Indian culture, and Indian culture already telling you, like my parents, they barely even had to tell me, but it was like a, you don't date, you don't talk to guys, you don't do anything till you graduate from college, you know? And so I think I already was trying to like please my parents that way and be obedient. But I would say like, I do think that generation of what the church taught us was actually really, I don't know if this is too strong of a word to use, but wounding in how I viewed dating, and how like I wouldn't even give guys a chance because I was like, if I can't marry them, then I'm not dating them. And I would say like there were a lot of people, again, in light of God calls me to wait in my 20s, but in light of that, there were many guys that I like didn't even give a chance to because I didn't actually try to get to know them. And a part of that is because of what was taught to us, you know, when we were growing up. Um, and so, yeah, so I think like that. So in my 30s, now that I know myself more, and have like developed like even my own voice and like know more so maybe what I'm looking for. I think even like the fact that like in Indian culture, like this is different for everyone, but even the way that you relate to your parents. Like, how do you talk to your parents? How much trust do you have with your parents? Do you even talk about dating with your parents? Like I mentioned earlier, like my parents and I are very open. Like we do share a lot. I do share with them my dating lives. I've had to like, you know, share minimally maybe at some points and more in other times, depending on, you know, how much pressure I'm getting from my parents. And so I think that big thing, that I've learned, at least from in my 20s, I'm taking into my 30s or have taken into my 30s, is I respect and love my parents and I care about what they think. But their voice is really loud. Like they are the loudest voice in my head sometimes. And I think what I've learned is the importance of community. And so I want to listen to my parents. I want to hear their voice. But I also talk to my community. Like I talk to my Christian community, men, women, single, married. I just can't stress the importance of having married men and women in your life, as well as single men and women in your life. I think like my parents thankfully like are open and will hear what I have to say even if they disagree with it. But I would say, I've really had to learn how to listen to what my parents have to say, but the main authority in my life is the voice of Jesus and what like the word of God says. And so, yeah, the importance of community. I also think in your 30s, like in your 20s and single, I feel like a lot of people are 20s and single, so it's not a big deal. When you're 30s and single, everyone around you is almost married. So let me tell you, like I feel like it literally affects my life in so many different ways, and not just like me personally being single now. It's like I go to church and everyone's single. I hang out with my friends, and I mean, I go to church and I'm the only one that's single because everyone's married. I go to my friends and they're all married. Like work, everyone's married. Like I just found out because I didn't think about this, but next year I'm going to be the only married woman of color person on my leadership team of managers. And I'm like, oh wow, my God, that's crazy. And so I think in your 30s, you definitely feel the singleness factor more because you're in all these different spaces where you're around a lot of other married people. Um, and then I would say like, I mentioned this a little right before this, but I would say you really like, it has been such a huge blessing. I can't stress the importance of having married men and women in my life. I feel like, you know, I don't know if others relate to this, but I feel like I was pretty naive and really focused on the Disney fairy tale mentality of marriage. And so I had all these fantasies of like, when I get married, like this is what's going to happen. And this is what I want to see happen. And yeah, right. And literally like a lot of my friends, because a lot of them are married, I have like, and they're what I appreciate about them is they're honest and vulnerable about their marriages. I've heard the ups and downs of marriage from people our age, like in their 20s and 30s. And it's literally given me a more realistic message, or a more realistic picture of what marriage could look like. And so honestly, like, I feel like I'm like grateful in some ways that I'm still single, because I might have gotten divorced if I like got like married when I was younger, just because I feel like I had such a fake picture, such a superficial picture of what marriage was. And so I'm so grateful for like many of my married friends, and these are not just Indian friends. Hey JP, JP actually is one of them that I'm talking about, like JP and his wife Ruby, Heidi and Elizabeth, who are Heidi's white and Elizabeth's Hispanic, and then like JP's Indian, like all these different families like that have been in my life that share vulnerably about their marriages and the ups and downs, have been such an amazing, I think, opportunity for me to learn more about marriage without even like being married yet. And so, yeah, just a couple other things before I kind of, let Nina go, is I think, I feel like because I did date like in my 20s and early 30s, I have more of a picture of what I want now. And I can actually name that, versus before, like, I don't know, just all the things that anyone would name. But now I actually have specific things that are important to me, because as a woman in ministry, just for example, as a woman in ministry and a South Asian woman in ministry, I need a man in my life who will support and affirm women in ministry. And honestly, that's been really hard to find. And so, different guys I've talked to, like I've literally had Indian guys tell me, like, if we get married, like you can't do ministry anymore. And you don't know how heartbreaking that is for me, but how immediately that like ends the relationship. And so if others on here have wisdom about that, feel free to talk to me about this, because I'm still learning how to navigate that.
Can I chime in for a second about that?
Yeah.
So actually, like something I didn't even know, and like I guess like kind of like through dating, like you learn things. So I was like talking to this guy, and like I'm not like bashing this church or anything like that, but apparently the Brethren Church doesn't believe women should minister, or like specifically minister like to audiences of men and women. And for me personally, I love giving sermons, and I understand like why maybe they have that stance, but that would mean that I could never give a church sermon, or I could never speak or share to the body of Christ. And that was my deal breaker. But it's like interesting too to see like how people have that view and they don't want to see women in that position. So like kind of understanding that experience is not for you, or that relationship is not for you.
Yeah, it's really tricky, and I feel like it's almost like it's scary to even talk about this on like IG Live. And no, not in a bad way, but just because like I'm still even like learning how to navigate this right now. Because honestly, like I didn't realize I grew up in a church that like they gave me a lot of opportunities to speak and lead. My mom has like literally been in every role in the Indian church I grew up with. And so for me, like I grew up in a household that like shattered all these like high like glass ceilings, and I think because of that, like I never questioned whether a woman could do all these things in the church. And then I moved from LA Indian church to like Texas, and like that's when I really started like, oh my god, like I like the church I went to, they don't allow women up front unless they're like singing. And at first I was like, okay, like I don't know, that's fine, I guess it's not a big deal. But then I was like, well, would they ever let me like do something up front? Like they support my ministry. And so I know this is like, we're a little bit going off a tangent right now, and so I will bring us back to the singleness talk. I know it's what you came for, but I would say I do think that is really tricky, because as a South Asian woman in ministry, like when I first came on, there were very few people I knew that were in ministry. And so it was like a new road to navigate. And now that I've been in ministry for over 15 years, like there's all these amazing women and men that I like can partner with. But when it comes to like, I think it's just such a new topic when you think about men and women in the church and gender roles, maybe for South Asians to think about. That like I don't want to write people off initially if they're gonna say like, what are you talking about, like and so I think for me, like I want to give a chance for people to do their own study, to actually study the Bible and figure out what do they believe about what scripture says, because there's a lot in scripture, and like we all have to do our fair work of navigating what do we believe the Holy Spirit is saying to us, what is our theology around that. And so all that to say, I feel like definitely that has been a big, like, for me, I was sharing about, like, I know more of what I want, or I'm not as afraid to say no to things, versus before I used to be like, I guess I should be open. I guess, like, if someone's interested, like, I should try to be open. But now I'm a little more like, no, that's not someone I'm interested in. Bye. And not in a mean way. Like, obviously I'm going to be polite and respectful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think like that has been one of the big things that like I realized, not knowing that as much in my 20s, that would be important for me if I get married in the future. Is like I need, that's one of the key things. But I do think in your 30s you kind of figure out more of what it is that you want, or what is it that would be like pretty important for you as you navigate like married life together.
Yeah, and I feel like I guess 20s and 30s are similar in many ways, and even like early 20s to late 20s are very different, and it can depend a lot on your friend circle and just like who you're around. Like, are your friends getting married or not getting married? But what's interesting is I'm actually really glad I come from the generation of like, the book that was really popular for me was How to Get a Date Worth Keeping, and I would highly recommend it. It's actually the opposite kind of like it's like date a lot and see what you like and see what you dislike, and you don't have to marry someone just because you went on a date with them, and just realizing like what parts of yourself kind of open up or close around different things and why you like or dislike things. So I feel like that's kind of my process in my 20s, and also being really careful of comparison, and even just like culture saying that you can't even, I feel like in particular, and I wonder if maybe this is something also you struggle with in your 30s, but I remember when I was growing up, I was told this narrative of you can't fully appreciate like celebrations even that your friends have if you haven't reached that phase yet. And it was kind of like a subtle message that was given to me, because I remember I was a kid and I was I was like 14, 15, and I was at someone's bridal shower, and somebody around marrying age ended up leaving a little bit earlier. And my mom actually, she said like, oh, when you're that age, you'll understand why she left. Like, it's hard to, and I do get that, like how you can compare yourself or whatever, but like honestly, I thoroughly enjoy like wedding celebrations, baby showers. Like I enjoy all those things, and I feel like it's such a bad mentality to have this comparison, and to have a comparison mentality, and that's something you could bring into other areas of your life, because yeah, maybe you are married and have a kid or whatever, but there's always something that you may lack that someone else has. And if you get into that mindset, you can kind of enter a space of like comparison and jealousy, rather than appreciating that like everyone's life is different, everyone has different things. But I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah.
And this kind of goes into our next question, which goes into this abundance versus scarcity mindset. So I grew up hearing, if you wait too long, you'll never get married. And like literally, like if you wait past 23, like you're never get married. All the guys will be taken by the time you're 22. So how do you maintain this abundance mindset in a culture focused on scarcity?
Yeah, it's funny because I just preached on that yesterday at an Indian church in New York, about God being the God of abundance.
Yeah.
I think honestly, like the longer you're single, I think the longer seasons of like hardship is what okay, sorry. I'm getting all these texts. I'm like trying to focus, but thanks, JP. I would say the longer that you're single, the longer that you go through seasons of like either hardship or like loneliness or trying to figure out like, God, like, where are you? Like, are you going to provide? What's going to happen? And so I think like what has been the most helpful for me is in seasons where I'm like, oh my gosh, God, like, where are you? Like, why haven't you shown up yet? I think one, we can be honest with God about how we're feeling and what's going on, and God can take it. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think what's been really helpful is I kind of tend to do this now every year before my birthday, or like whenever I hit a harder season or something, I'll ask the Lord, like, God, I need a word of encouragement. I need you to remind me that you are with me in this area. And honestly, in my 20s, like, so I've done this multiple times. So I have lots of different images or like verses or songs or something God has given me. But I would say, like, in my 20s, God gave me the, um, the image or the story that we're all familiar with if you grew up in the church of Abraham and Sarah. And when, you know, the angel came and told Sarah that she would have a baby, she laughed. And you know, and then he like was convicted, and the angel was like, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" And that really stuck with me. And I felt like the Lord was like asking me the same thing and was like, is anything too hard for the Lord? And so that was definitely one picture of like, oh my gosh, like, why am I making God too small in my eyes? I would say, I mean, there's been a lot of different pictures. God has given me Psalm 63 from that prayer time, which for many years I held on to. I think even like why I preached yesterday on John 6 on the feeding of the 5,000, because a few years ago when I prayed again right before my birthday, asked the Lord, like, I need a word or an image or something encouraging for this next year. And I think that was like 34 to 35. And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna be 35, like mid-30s. You know, like once you hit 30, you're like, oh my God, I'm 30. Then you hit 35, you're like, oh my God, I'm 35. And now that I just turned 37, it's like, oh my God, I'm about to be 40. Like, it's like kind of crazy to think about it. But I feel like the Lord gave me the passage in Psalm 92, and it talks about being green and fertile, and even in your old age, that you will bear fruit. And even though that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be in my singleness, I feel like every time I've come to the Lord and asked him to give me a word or an image or a passage, a song, something to encourage me, he has given it to me. And so even the feeding of the 5,000, which is God taking what little you have, whatever you have, give it to the Lord and he will multiply. Honestly, that has been so encouraging to me. And so one, like, biblical stories and asking the Lord to give you a word, an image, something to give you like encouragement, to give you hope. But two, I would say, like, open your eyes. Like, part of even in the passage of the feeding of the 5,000 is Jesus looked up and saw, and he saw the need of the people around him. What up, Terry? Glad you could join. I would say is what, like, when you look up, like, I've noticed I have a lot of friends, like, I have a lot of friends that got married in their 20s, like either right after graduating from college, in their 20s, and then, you know, in my 30s. But I would say, like, in the last 2 years, I've had like literally 5 to 10 women in their like 38, 39, 40 get married. And it was all guys that they met like pretty quickly and randomly, and they got married and had a kid. I mean, I don't know if that's like your jam, that's like a little quick for me, but like literally, like, met someone, got married, had a kid, and like it happened like in a blink of an eye. And so I think for me, like, seeing those stories, hearing those stories, sharing those stories for you guys who are listening right now, even though like someone else just told me, like, I met her on a random call for like, one of my friends was actually speaking, who's on this call right now. I was on a call with her and one of the girls talking about racial justice and things that are going on. And when I was in a breakout room, we were talking, and I don't know how the singleness thing came up, but the woman I was talking to she was like, I'm 47 and I'm getting married next week, and it's my first marriage. And even though, like, I mean, I was like, oh my God, that's awesome. I was like, 47. I was like, God, I don't know, make me wait till 47. But I was like, wow, Lord, even there is another example that it doesn't matter. Like, God can provide at any age. And so I think like stories like that are so encouraging, asking the Lord to speak into it. And then honestly, community, like having people that speak truth to you, having people that you can be reminded, like, that will speak truth to you and like encourage you, have been really helpful.
Yeah, I love that example of that woman who is like was 47 and got married. Just like a reminder of like God can provide at any age. And I think kind of like going back to scarcity mindset idea, like I kind of like growing up, if you think, oh, if I'm not 22, if I'm not 29, if I'm not 30 and married, like it has this like negative mentality because you're putting a timeline on what God has in mind for you, and everyone's timeline is different. And for that person, if she was 47 and she got married to the person that she wanted, like that's all that matters, you know? And I feel like we forget sometimes that marriage is not all of a sudden like you get married and everything's amazing. It's like that's also a journey and a struggle in its own way. So I love that, and like I actually want to put that into practice too. Like, what are the messages? What are the ways that God's reminding me to seek abundance instead of, because God is a God who has everything in control, and like He could literally place the right person for you in front of you right now, but maybe you're not ready for it, or maybe it's not the right time. So I love those examples, and I wanted to go into the next question, which I think like a lot of people can relate to. And that's, in what ways do you face struggles of being specifically Indian and single? Yeah, and we're actually going to get, thank you for your comments. What if marriage is not in the cards? What's the point of marriage? We have a question towards the end about what if you're called to singleness? So we'll definitely get to that, because that's something I've always wondered too.
Yeah, definitely. I think, in what ways do you face struggles by being specifically Indian and single? I think one of the hardest things about being South Asian and single is the pressure from your parents and your community. And I think that will never go away. Like, honestly, once you get married, it's like the next thing. You know what I mean? I think like it breaks my heart. Like, I know women in my church that have stopped going to church, like because of aunties and uncles that are always asking them, like, why aren't you getting married? What's going on? And I get it. Like, that's like really tiring and emotionally exhausting to hear and have people ask you that over and over again, when you yourself are trying to figure out like what's happening, or you're emotionally trying to figure out like how you're doing. And then you have a ton of other people asking you that over and over and over again.
On you.
Yeah. So I would say, like, to me, that's like the number one, the biggest struggle. And it continues to be like, even with my parents right now, like I'm at home with my parents, and like it definitely comes up. Like, I'm watching that arranged marriage matchmaker show, and my dad literally goes, instead of watching other people's love lives, why aren't you working on your own?
Sounds like my parents.
I was like, oh my God. But that's like the truth of like what happens, like the kind of like commentary we get. And so I would say like that's kind of like, I would say that's the biggest struggle for me personally. But I would say the other thing is, we just, as South Asian women, especially, for South Asian men, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but for South Asian women, I just feel like there's also so many like criteria that we're supposed to like fit. And so like, I think just the fact that like we're expected to, like, someone I know, like they're like, I mean, let's just say we're expected to like have a good job and be Christian and cook in the home and do this XYZ. I feel like that there is so much criteria and like pressure that is placed on women as a South Asian woman. And so I would say that's like definitely another struggle, because I feel like our culture places a lot of value on excellence, and doing everything with excellence. And that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like even just like going back to the idea of excellence, being South Asian, your parents want you to have the best grades. They want you to do whatever in their head is best. And for them, that can also be like, I feel like this is like a checklist mentality that a lot of parents have of like, okay, I have kids now. My job is to make sure my kids are married, that they have children, that they're whatever. So yeah, that naturally ends up being something that they pressure you to do, because I think ultimately something that helps me too is realizing this comes from a place of love. Like, my parents genuinely love me, they care for me, they want what's best for me. So when they're pushing me that way, that's them expressing their love. And yeah, and even just having open conversations, like I still work with my dad, like he doesn't see my point of view yet, but my mom has opened up a lot, and she's kind of like, she was someone who got married at 21. In her mind, that was like, brown excellence, But for her, realizing like, hey, maybe that's not the case for my daughter, but that's okay, and like being more open to that. And I want to go into another question. Let's see. Okay, so these are some questions from the audience, things that were sent in. You guys can send in more things. I'm loving this. I'm personally learning. So. But yeah, first question is something I've always been curious about. And how do you know if you're called to singleness? Because I remember, not growing up, but like being in the Christian circle, you hear like there's a gift of singleness, and some people have it. And like for me, having a fear of like, what if I have that gift? So how do you know if you have that gift or that call or whatever?
I mean, this might seem like a cheating way to answer this, but I'm like, if you're not married right now, it's necessary. I mean, I think it also comes back to what does called mean. Like if you're not married, then God has invited you to be to be single in this season.
Yeah.
And so I think like if you're not married right now, then you need to ask the Lord, like, if I'm single right now, what is it that you want me to focus on? Because I think a hard thing has been like, I don't know, in my 20s, I was like, okay, like always wanted to get married in my late 20s. So, initially in my 20s, I wasn't like in a rush to like get married or anything because I was like, oh, I only want to get married in my late 20s, no biggie. But then, it was like, I mean, I shared earlier about my mine did feel specific because I felt like the Lord actually gave me passages on waiting. And so as you heard earlier, like there were specific like passages or like words or songs that God gave me. That's when I knew like God was calling me to be single, and it was like a call. But even after like when I was 30, I felt like the Lord said it is finished, and I was like, it is finished, and I was like, oh my God, it's finished. I'm not gonna be single anymore. I'm gonna get married. And guess what? I'm 37. It's like 7 years. That was 7 years ago. And I thought like, oh, it is finished meant like, oh, now I'm gonna get married. But no, like there's so much God has been teaching me, even if I'm not married, even about singleness and marriage in this season. And so I think, just part of the waiting is like even not just about waiting for this to happen, but for us to have eyes that are open for the things that God wants to do in the midst of before he provides someone for us.
Yeah.
So it's kind of crazy because I would say singleness feels like, as a South Asian person, and because South Asian culture really values marriage and doesn't have a high value for singles, I would say like singleness feels like a weakness. Like, oh my God, like I don't want to talk about singleness. Like honestly, I like don't talk a ton about singleness because I feel like it almost is like shameful to talk about it. Like no one wants like to I feel like my parents, like they would be like, why do you keep talking about this? Do you just want everyone to know you're single? Like but I think something that God has really been teaching me and showing me is in the very thing that I feel like invisible in or unseen in or feel like it's shameful in Indian culture, God is using it in such significant ways to be a witness in the kingdom of God. And honestly, I wrote this singleness article. If you didn't have a chance to read it, it's on my IG account. But honestly, like writing that singleness article was like felt really vulnerable to me, even though like you probably read it and you're like, yeah, like we all agree. But it was so vulnerable to me because I was like, oh no, like what are my like uncles and aunties gonna say as they read it? What are achins, which are like pastors in my Malayalam in my denomination, like what are they going to say when they see this? Like people even commented on it and I couldn't tell, like, did they read the article or just like saying good job, daughter, mole, but I would say like the very thing that I feel like sometimes feels shaming in Indian culture, God has really used it to open opportunities to speak, to teach, to encourage women and men in singleness, in marriage, in prayer, like whatever, like so many different things comes out of it. And so honestly, I don't know if I'm fully answering the question, but I would say if you're not married, you're probably called to be single. You're pretty much like single or called to be single till you get married. That's how I would probably answer it. And I know that might not satisfy everyone on this, but that's probably what I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, I totally agree with that because, like, it's even this mentality of like wanting to like exit your singleness as soon as possible, but just realizing like God's calling you to this right now, and there's specific things that you're able to do in this season that would be harder in a different season. And yeah, thank you for like being vulnerable and sharing that because I've even had like, and I think this is like a big tip I have for anyone, like have talks with your parents and maybe more open than you think. They just want to kind of understand. And like even subtle ways where kind of like culture would tell me that I'm not worth as much as maybe a couple or whatever, or like another group or somebody who's in a relationship. And me just challenging that and saying like, no, like I am whole, I am enough right now, And it kind of goes back to this idea of like a relationship is not like two half people making one. It's like two whole people coming together. And that's just a reminder of like, hey, I can still, and honestly, even if you are married too, like you can still work on yourself, you can still grow on yourself. But I feel like it's like very, like being single and being able to work on yourself is also like a beautiful opportunity. And there's beauty in this season as well. And I think there's also something about desire. Like if you're someone who doesn't desire marriage, like I would think maybe then you'd be called singleness. But thank you for a reminder of like, hey, if you're in that season, then God's calling you to that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go next. Actually, we have a question here. So I want to look at this question. Oh, Sydney asked this question. What are top 3 qualities you look for when getting to know someone?
Yeah. I mean, this is going to be different for everyone. So this is not like the answer for everybody. But I mean, I think for me, the big things are like their relationship with Jesus. How is that lived out? Like, I want to hear more about that. That's like, for me, like number one important. I think kind of their like family values. I think because family is so important in South Asian culture, like we are kind of marrying into 2 families. Like I do believe that. I would say like that is really important to me. So I want to know about their families and like how do they interact? What do they communicate? How do they communicate? I would say to me, like I shared earlier, like this is probably not one for everyone else. But to me, the woman in ministry is a big question, just because I am a woman in ministry and you know, teach and speak and lead both men and women, and am in a full-time like campus minister. That's another huge value for me. And so those are probably the top 3 that I definitely have in my like initial conversations with people.
I'm kind of like throwing in a question. We have another question here, but like I want to throw in another question just like because I'm curious. But so something I've always kind of looked for is like the guy being a leader. But I've gotten a lot of like feedback from people saying like that's kind of getting picky or like that's not like fair to whatever. So I guess like from your perspective, like when have you been able to discern from yourself like when am I just having a standard versus like when am I just being picky?
Yeah. I think that's like a harder question. I'm like trying to figure out how should I answer that. I mean, I think like if these things are biblical and these are not like these are core things to surviving a marriage, I think that's like a pretty like that's like standard. I think it gets picky when you can still have a healthy marriage and you don't need those things.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think for me, like the reason the woman in ministry is huge is because I do like speak in the church and I do lead up front. And if someone is like, oh no, you can't do that, that's almost like that's like everything I do like right now. So that feels really hard. Yeah. But if it's like, oh, but I want him to just be really tall. Nothing wrong with that, but like you can marry a not as tall person and still have a great marriage. You know what I mean? And so I think it's like really like that's like you probably have to wrestle with that, and like that's where the community comes in and like ask your 2 to 3 friends like what do you think about like these things I'm praying through, like you know, especially your married friends. That's probably a good question to ask them, because I like a lot of my married friends were like the things I looked for like once we got married some of those things didn't matter anymore. And so that's why I do like to consult my married friends. Even around like this topic, I like talked to a few of my friends. I was like, hey, can I talk to you and your husbands about this topic? Because I need more insight. It's really different when you're single, and thinking about it, but when you're actually married and living it out, it looks really differently. And I don't have experience and I don't know what that looks like. So that's where I do like rely and depend on my married friends to actually give me insight from their marriages.
Yeah, I love that point because like I honestly also don't know what it's like. So maybe I'm really valuing like I remember when I was a kid I really wanted a guy who could play guitar. And then I got older and realized I really don't care. Like it's fine. But I guess that goes back to that idea. Okay, so I wanted to go to a Instagram question. How much is cultural background a factor when it comes to dating for you? Do you prefer dating other South Asians due to ease, or do you truly not care? I know you kind of talked about this already, but I guess we can just go back to it.
Yeah, I'm open to anyone because I feel like honestly, like I feel like I'm still figuring out what I even want. And I'm just like, Lord, you know what I need. So I'm going to trust you in that. I do prefer a South Asian. And so I mainly date Indian guys, but I've definitely dated all ethnicities because if they have like a lot of my main values, I'm not going to say no.
Yeah, and I think I'm the same way. I also prefer Indian guys, but I'm open to everyone. And my parents, like, I think that's another thing too. Like, if you're very close to your parents, let's say like they don't like that or whatever, like that's a whole different discussion. But yeah, for me, it's the same thing. Okay, I think we went through all the points, but I know you had like your own notes. Are there any like other big points or anything that you want to mention that, anything else that you want to mention that you didn't get a chance to mention?
I do think I didn't say anything about sex, but I'll come back to that real quick. I would say I do think dating is a really vulnerable thing to do. And South Asian culture doesn't really teach us to be vulnerable in many areas of our lives. So dating can be tricky if you're not willing to be vulnerable. And so I think that is an area of growth for South Asians in general, is like, how do we become more vulnerable in getting to know each other and sharing about ourselves? And so I think, I think about just ministry and the ways that the areas that South Asians, like, I want to like disciple them in. And I feel like it like applies to dating as well and like getting married. I mean, the one thing I did want to say about sex, which I know feels really weird because we don't talk about sex in South Asian culture, and it feels weird to even talk about here right now, is I like one thing that I would say is different as someone who has abstained and is waiting for marriage. I would say like your 30s. I mean, this is depends on like your dating, like how many people you've dated and what your boundaries are. But because I only had one serious relationship, I would, and in my 30s, I would say like I never really like struggled with like wanting to have sex or like when is that going to happen, like in my 20s. But I would say in my 30s, after like I did like start being affectionate and like be more like have like physical like relationships with a guy, I would say like that it like definitely increased more of a desire for like, oh my god, when is that going to happen, when will I have sex? And I think like that is a reality, that like we are just human beings and God created us with sex drives. And that is a natural part about being a male or a female. And there's no shame in that. I think it's like, how do you deal with that? Do you have community to help you make the right decisions? Do you like how do you respond in the midst of that would be like, what are healthy next steps? But I would say like, I think in the midst of it, like sex is healthy. We were designed to have sex. Like I hope to enjoy sex within the confines of marriage at some point in my life. But I think like I don't like, and for those of you who have like who've already like had sex, like I don't want to shame anyone. And I think if anything, you can learn from those experiences and talk to your close community around that. But I think like, at least from my experience, like I do want to wait. I do think that's biblical. And I think like when I do get married, I plan on enjoying it. And I know that might be really uncomfortable for people to hear, or like, why are you saying that? But I think like we don't talk about sex at all in a Christian setting. And I feel like, I like talk about it with some of my non-Indian friends, and like, I mean, sometimes they share a little too much for me. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't need to know all that. But I'm also like, again, the thing with having married friends is the things that you learn from like them, both like good, hard, uncomfortable, comfortable. And so I am grateful for my married friends who have been honest, even in those areas. But I mean, we all have our own boundaries and limits of what we want to hear or how much we want to know. So obviously honoring and respecting that as well.
Yeah, you're right. Like sex is not shameful. Like immediately the idea of like shame came to mind, but that goes back to the idea of like the book that you mentioned, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I know some people were actually kind of traumatized even into their married lives because of like the way they thought of sex and relationships. They thought of it as something bad, and ultimately sex is a gift from God. And I want to throw out a resource that I actually felt was really helpful for me. There's this podcast called Stephanie Mae Wilson podcast, and she has an entire episode about being single and kind of navigating your sex drive and desires and whatever through a Christian context. So I would highly recommend that because it's not something shameful. It's not something you have to think of as shameful, but just like you, I also would love to enjoy sex one day, but in the confines of marriage and honoring God. Yeah. Okay. I don't think we got any other questions, but let's see. Oh, wait, we did. Okay. Hanisha, I'm sorry if I'm saying her name wrong. She said, what are the red flags you look for? And I guess this could be our last question. And thank you for 2 questions. She gave us another one as well. Yeah. So what are the red flags?
Okay. Red I mean, we don't always get the opportunity to do this, but if you have mutual friends with whoever you're talking to and asking them some questions just to feel them out, if they don't line up, then to me, that's a red flag in terms of like dishonest, like not being honest.
Okay.
I mean, that's like a side thing. Let me think about this a little bit. If you have any, feel free to share. I'm like, what are some red flags?
I remember once hearing, it was like always stood out to me. It was like some podcast, but when you have rose-colored glasses, all the red flags just look the same. So just being careful with your perspective, because like when you're first like talking to someone or whatever, it makes them amazing and nothing can be wrong. So just being aware of that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say red flags are like, because I had shared what my 3 main values are, and one is like their relationship with Jesus. I'm always asking about like, how did they come to know the Lord, or their church upbringing, kind of different ways of asking the like, I want to know more about your faith with Jesus. I mean, if they can't, I will not like cut anyone off if they don't know how to share that, because many people don't know even how to share that. But if you start asking questions and like they're not really living out their faith, or they don't have community, or they can't share like really like how they're living out their faith with God, like to me that's like an orange flag. You know, is like, is this because they don't know how to articulate it? Or is this because they're just saying they're Christian? And so I do have like a lot of questions I ask around that, because also I'm in ministry and I realize like I ask a lot of questions and my students know how to answer them because they're trained to answer them. But like if you're not in ministry, like they might be like I remember a guy telling me like I've never even heard anyone say that question before, and I was like, oh, and I was trying to figure out what's like a different way of asking this question that's not maybe super ministry like. And so I think even like, you know, there's different ways to gather information, but that's definitely like one thing for me. I think a red flag is if they say certain things and then they don't practice it. If they're like, oh, I don't like do this or XYZ, and then you're out with them and they're doing it, you know, and that doesn't mean you can't ask them about it and have a conversation about it. But like that, like to me is it's like an orange flag. I guess I'm having a hard time figuring out red flags. Yeah, but I feel like, because I'm always about like, you got to ask more questions and get to the root of it. You can't just like blindly like see something or read something and like not and like decide like this is done.
We got one more question. I'm sorry, but it's like a really good one. So just one more.
Yeah.
Okay. What if, as a single woman, no guys are pursuing you? What is your opinion on women pursuing? Oh, this is a really good one. What's your opinion on women pursuing men? I always wondered too, because I'm naturally like a go-getter, but I'm like, let me not be the one pursuing. So yeah, I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, and I think I'm still figuring that out for myself. I think also like how you define pursue is a big part of that question, because honestly, like this is my personal. I would prefer for a guy to pursue me, and what I mean by that is that they take some initiative to let me know that they want to like date me, or they are interested in me. I feel like the initiative is a big thing for me. And if they don't model initiative, then it makes me wonder, like, if we get more serious or if we get married, if they're not showing initiative now, what will they show it then? And so for me, like, that's a big part, but that doesn't mean like, to me, like, if your girl's like is like not necessarily flirting with them or lets them know that they like them, to me, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's more, can guys take the initiative to pursue them after that? And so I know that there's probably mixed views about that. And I'm totally open for more conversations around that. I don't know if I personally would just go tell someone I like them. If I knew they liked me and then I was like, didn't like them, then I liked them, it would make sense to be like, hey, actually, I am interested in you. And then maybe, I don't even know if I have the guts to do that. Like, I would go do that. I personally would be just like, have the guy pursue me, but that doesn't mean like the whole relationship, he's just pursuing you. It's like a back and forth. So I think initially, it's more of like, I want a guy to take initiative. But I don't think it's wrong for a woman to like let them know you're interested.